Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a rough-hewn log cabin on the edge of the Kentucky wilderness, a place where the land was harsh, the winters bit deep, and survival demanded unrelenting labor. His family lived in persistent poverty, owning little beyond their determination and the tools with which they worked the soil. His father, Thomas Lincoln, struggled as a subsistence farmer and carpenter, eking out a meager living from thin, rocky fields. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, provided what warmth she could, nurturing her children with patience and faith. But when Abraham was only 9 years old, she died suddenly from milk sickness, leaving a hollow grief in the boy's young heart. The loss struck like a shadow that lingered over his early years, deepening his sense of solitude and shaping the quiet, inward nature that would follow him all his life. After his mother's death, his father remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, who brought new energy and care into the household. She encouraged Abraham's curiosity, protecting the spark of intellect that glimmered in him even amidst hardship. Yet the family remained poor, and Abraham's days were dominated by physical labor. He worked from dawn until dark, clearing forests, splitting rails, planting corn, and tending livestock. The life was brutal and unrelenting, with little room for leisure or comfort. Still, the boy absorbed everything around him: the rhythms of the seasons, the struggles of his neighbors, and the silent strength demanded by survival on the frontier. These hardships did not break him, they forged him, tempering his will with endurance and patience. Formal schooling was a rare luxury in that world, and Lincoln received less than a year of scattered instruction in small one-room schools. Teachers came and went, and books were scarce, yet he possessed a voracious hunger for knowledge that no circumstance could suppress. He borrowed books from anyone who had them, walking miles to return them after long nights of reading by firelight. He devoured the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Pilgrim's Progress, and any histories or law books he could find, often copying passages by hand to memorize them. He trained his mind as relentlessly as he trained his body, teaching himself to think clearly, speak persuasively, and reason through complex problems. This self-education became the quiet engine of his rise, instilling in him both intellectual discipline and a lifelong reverence for learning. As he grew older, Lincoln sought work beyond his family's farm, hiring himself out as a laborer to help support the household. He became known as a dependable rail splitter, able to wield an axe with tireless strength, and he worked on neighboring farms, earning small wages for days filled with sweat and exhaustion. He also took jobs ferrying goods on flatboats down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, encountering bustling river towns and the larger world beyond the isolated frontier. These experiences broadened his perspective, exposing him to commerce, industry, and the deep injustices of slavery, which he witnessed firsthand in the markets of New Orleans. The sight of chained men and women being bought and sold left an imprint on him, though he spoke little of it at the time. Life on the frontier demanded self-reliance, and Lincoln absorbed this lesson thoroughly. He grew tall and strong, with a lean frame hardened by years of physical toil. But beneath his rugged exterior lived a mind that quietly questioned and reflected. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to observe before acting, and to rely on his own judgment when guidance was scarce. He lived among people who prized honesty, hard work, and resilience, and these values sank deep into him. While many around him accepted their lot as fixed, Lincoln carried within him a restless conviction that birth did not have to dictate destiny. He believed, even then, that through effort and integrity, a person might rise above their station. The isolation of his upbringing also nurtured his empathy. He saw the struggles of ordinary people, their debts, their losses, their small victories, and felt kinship with them. He never grew accustomed to luxury or privilege because he had none, and this grounded him in the realities of the common man. Every hardship he endured became a thread woven into the fabric of his character. The hunger that taught him self-discipline, the grief that taught him compassion, the labor that taught him perseverance. These formative years did not merely shape his body or sharpen his mind, they instilled in him a profound humility and a deep moral resolve. By the time he reached adulthood, Lincoln carried the marks of the frontier in every part of him: the weathered hands of a laborer, the keen eyes of a thinker, and the quiet strength of someone who had endured loss without surrendering hope. He emerged from his youth without wealth, prestige, or connections, but with something rarer: an unshakable belief that character mattered more than circumstance. This belief, planted in the soil of poverty and nurtured by hardship, would become the bedrock upon which he built his entire life. In the early 1830s, Abraham Lincoln left behind the familiar backwoods of his youth and ventured into the unsettled but promising landscapes of Illinois. He was 21, lanky and unrefined, with little more than a change of clothes, a restless ambition, and an unyielding determination to rise above the obscurity of his birth. He settled first in the small village of New Salem, a cluster of rough-hewn buildings perched on the bluffs overlooking the Sangamon River. The settlement was alive with the raw energy of the frontier: merchants, millers, blacksmiths, and farmers striving to carve permanence from wilderness. Lincoln entered this world as a laborer, performing any work he could find: splitting rails, stacking goods, moving freight along the river. He worked briefly in a general store, where his towering frame and quick wit drew the curiosity of the townsfolk. Though awkward in appearance, he possessed an easy humor and an instinctive kindness that disarmed strangers and earned him trust. His days were consumed by toil, yet his nights belonged to books. He borrowed volumes from neighbors, often walking miles to return them, and read with an almost feverish hunger. He absorbed grammar manuals, Shakespeare, law treatises, newspapers, and the speeches of classical orators. In a town where few men valued learning, his self-education made him an oddity, but also a figure of growing respect. He began to form opinions about the structure of society and the power of law, seeing in them the tools by which a man might ascend beyond the circumstances of his birth. The rough democracy of frontier Illinois offered him, for the first time, a sense that his ambitions were not absurd. He watched how local leaders earned influence through their words and deeds, and a quiet conviction took root that he could do the same. In 1832, the Black Hawk War broke out between the United States and a confederation of Sauk and Fox tribes. When volunteers were called, Lincoln enlisted in the local militia. He was elected captain by his peers, an honor that astonished him, for he had never commanded anyone before. The campaign involved little actual fighting, and Lincoln never saw combat, but he endured long marches, poor provisions, and the constant strain of uncertainty. His conduct impressed those around him. He was steady under hardship, fair in his treatment of others, and able to diffuse tensions with calm reasoning. When the war ended, he returned to New Salem with a newfound sense of confidence, knowing he had earned the trust of men through character alone. That same year, he made his first foray into public life, declaring himself a candidate for the Illinois General Assembly. His platform emphasized internal improvements, roads, canals, and infrastructure to connect scattered settlements and foster commerce. He campaigned tirelessly, traveling on foot and horseback to meet voters, shaking hands and speaking wherever he could gather a crowd. Though he lacked wealth, family influence, or formal education, he relied on sincerity and the plain logic of his arguments. He lost the election, finishing 8th out of 13 candidates, yet his candidacy left an impression. Many who had dismissed him as an unpolished youth now regarded him as a man of promise. Undeterred by defeat, Lincoln resolved to strengthen his mind. He took work as a postmaster in New Salem, a modest position that allowed him ample time to read. He also became a deputy county surveyor, learning geometry and land measurement from borrowed textbooks. The discipline of surveying honed his precision and patience, while delivering letters and newspapers exposed him to the currents of national affairs. Slowly, his reputation grew as someone reliable, methodical, and eager to serve. Around this time, he began studying law in earnest, reading Blackstone's commentaries and other legal volumes late into the night, sprawled on the floor of a cramped cabin by the dim light of a fire. With no teacher but his own persistence, he traced the intricate logic of legal reasoning until it became familiar to him, shaping his thoughts into order. In 1834, he ran for the state legislature again. This time, his efforts bore fruit. With the support of local merchants, farmers, and craftsmen who admired his diligence, he won a seat as a representative from Sangamon County. The victory marked a turning point. For the first time in his life, Lincoln held public office, entrusted with a role in shaping the laws of his state. It was both a personal triumph and a solemn responsibility. He moved to Springfield, the new capital of Illinois, and immersed himself in legislative work while continuing his legal studies. Within 3 years, he passed the bar and began practicing as an attorney, traveling from town to town on the 8th Judicial Circuit, arguing cases before judges and juries. His clients were often small farmers and shopkeepers, people much like those among whom he had grown up, and he approached their cases with an uncommon integrity. These years were a crucible in which Lincoln's identity transformed. From an unschooled frontier youth, he became an articulate lawyer and a respected member of the political community. The hardships of his early life had left their mark: his plain speech, his empathy for the poor, his distrust of arrogance. But he was no longer confined by them. He had begun to see the world as malleable, shaped by human effort and principle. Each small step forward, from the store counter to the surveying chain to the legislative chamber, confirmed his belief that upward mobility was not a myth. It was real if one possessed the patience to work for it and the honesty to retain the trust of others. In the raw, restless air of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln had taken his first deliberate steps into the realm of power, carrying with him the endurance of hardship and the quiet, growing conviction that his destiny lay far beyond the horizon he had once known. By the 1850s, the American nation stood at a breaking point. The uneasy balance between free and slave states was collapsing under the weight of expansion, ambition, and moral conflict. Every new territory carved from the frontier raised the same question: would it be free soil or slave soil? The Compromise of 1850 had only delayed the reckoning, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, allowing settlers to decide the status of slavery by popular sovereignty, fanned the embers into open flames. The country split not only along geographic lines, but within families and communities, as the moral and economic systems of North and South drifted toward collision. It was into this volatile atmosphere that Abraham Lincoln, long absent from public life, stepped once more. After serving a single term in Congress from 1847 to 1849, Lincoln had retreated from politics to concentrate on his law practice in Springfield. Over the following years, he became one of the most sought-after attorneys in Illinois, known for his clarity of argument and unwavering honesty. Yet as he rode the circuit from county to county, trying cases in small courthouses and sharing stories in taverns at night, he could not ignore the growing convulsions of the nation. The repeal of the Missouri Compromise by the Kansas-Nebraska Act struck him like a personal blow. For decades, that compromise had stood as a fragile barrier limiting the spread of slavery. Now it was gone, replaced by a doctrine that made human bondage a matter of popular choice. Lincoln saw in this not democracy, but the corrosion of its principles. Though cautious by nature, he felt compelled to speak. He returned to politics not with bluster, but with carefully reasoned speeches that pierced through the noise of partisanship. He framed the issue not merely as a political dispute, but as a moral crisis. Slavery, he argued, was incompatible with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed that all men were created equal. His words were measured and calm, yet beneath their composure burned a fierce conviction. Unlike the fiery abolitionists, he did not call for immediate emancipation where slavery already existed, but he refused to accept its spread into new territories. This position placed him squarely within the emerging Republican Party, which formed in the mid-1850s as a coalition of former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, and Free Soilers. Lincoln became one of its rising voices in Illinois, known less for emotional appeals than for the force of his logic. In 1856, he campaigned vigorously for the Republican presidential candidate John C. Fremont, delivering speeches across Illinois that blended legal reasoning with moral urgency. Though Fremont lost, Lincoln's efforts earned him admiration within the party. 2 years later, he reached for a higher stage. The Illinois Senate seat held by Stephen A. Douglas, the nation's most prominent Democrat and architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was up for election. Lincoln accepted the Republican nomination to challenge him. The contest that followed became one of the most famous in American political history. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 unfolded across 7 towns in Illinois, drawing immense crowds who traveled for miles to witness them. The two men could not have appeared more different. Douglas was short, combative, and seasoned, a master of political theater. Lincoln stood tall and gaunt, awkward in posture, yet commanding in presence once he began to speak. His voice, high but firm, carried with unrelenting clarity across the fields and fairgrounds where the debates were held. He built his arguments like an architect, stone upon stone, dismantling Douglas's defense of popular sovereignty. If slavery was morally wrong, he asked, how could its expansion be left to mere majority vote? He warned that a house divided against itself could not stand. The Union could not endure permanently half slave and half free. It would become one or the other. Those words reverberated far beyond Illinois. Newspapers across the country printed Lincoln's speeches in full, often on their front pages. Audiences who had never seen him now knew his name and, more importantly, his ideas. Though Douglas ultimately won re-election through the machinations of the state legislature, Lincoln had achieved something greater. He had transformed himself from a regional figure into a national one. His calm demeanor, intellectual rigor, and moral clarity marked him as a statesman in an age when the nation craved steady hands. The debates revealed his rare ability to fuse reason and principle, to appeal not only to the passions of the moment, but to the conscience of the Republic. After the election, Lincoln returned to his law practice, but he was no longer merely a lawyer riding the circuit. He was now a man whose words shaped the course of public thought. Invitations to speak poured in from across the North. In 1859 and 1860, he traveled widely, addressing audiences in Ohio, Wisconsin, and New York. Each appearance broadened his recognition and refined his message. He spoke not as a radical seeking upheaval, but as a conservative defender of the nation's founding principles. This posture reassured moderates who feared extremism, even as it attracted those who sought moral leadership against the spread of slavery. By the close of the decade, Lincoln's transformation was complete. Once an obscure frontier lawyer, he now stood among the foremost voices of a movement reshaping American politics. He had entered the national arena not by force of wealth or pedigree, but through the relentless discipline of his mind and the incorruptible gravity of his convictions. The nation, fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions, had begun to look toward him, not yet as its leader, but as a man who might one day hold it together. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, the nation stood on the edge of dissolution. His victory, secured without a single Southern electoral vote, convinced the leaders of the slaveholding states that their influence within the Union had ended. Even before he took office, South Carolina seceded, followed quickly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By the time Lincoln traveled from Illinois to Washington for his inauguration in March 1861, the Confederate States of America had formed a rival government under Jefferson Davis. Lincoln arrived in the capital under threat of assassination, passing through Baltimore in secret. The air was heavy with foreboding, and many doubted that the Union could be preserved. Lincoln assumed the presidency with no blueprint for the crisis. The Constitution offered no clear guidance on secession, and much of the federal government had fallen into disarray. The army was small and scattered, the treasury strained, and public trust fragile. Yet Lincoln approached the chaos with a calm determination that masked the weight he carried. He believed the Union to be perpetual and indivisible, not a mere contract of states that could be dissolved at will. To him, disunion was not simply a political rebellion, but an existential threat to the experiment of Republican government. He resolved to hold the Union together, even if it meant war. The war began in April 1861, when Confederate artillery fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The attack electrified the North, rallying public opinion behind the preservation of the Union. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, and thousands rushed to enlist. Yet the scale of the conflict soon overwhelmed the amateur forces. The Union suffered early defeats, most notably at the First Battle of Bull Run, shattering illusions of a quick victory. Lincoln faced constant turmoil, public criticism, cabinet rivalries, and wavering generals who either moved too slowly or squandered men recklessly. He spent long hours in the War Department telegraph office, reading battlefield dispatches as they arrived, absorbing the news in silence before deciding his next move. Lincoln's leadership grew through hardship. He learned to navigate the fractious personalities of his military commanders, replacing those who faltered and promoting those who showed resolve. He clashed with General George B. McClellan, whose caution paralyzed the Army of the Potomac, and endured political backlash when he removed him. He sought generals who grasped the scale of the conflict and were willing to use the full force of the Union's resources. Meanwhile, he worked to prevent the border slave states of Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware from joining the Confederacy, using a mix of military pressure and political tact to keep them in the Union. Their loyalty, strategically vital, prevented Washington from being encircled and kept the Ohio and Mississippi valleys secure. As the war dragged on, its human cost mounted. Casualties reached into the tens of thousands after battles like Shiloh, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. Public morale wavered and anti-war sentiment grew. Lincoln bore the grief of each loss privately, often retreating into solitude after receiving casualty lists. Yet he also began to reshape the war's purpose. What had begun as a struggle to preserve the Union became, under his guidance, a moral crusade. In September 1862, after the hard-fought Union victory at Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be free. It was a bold stroke that redefined the conflict. The war was no longer only about Union, it was about human freedom. The proclamation discouraged European powers from recognizing the Confederacy, rallied abolitionists to the Union cause, and allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, adding tens of thousands of new soldiers to its ranks. Despite this shift, the war remained brutal and uncertain. Confederate armies under generals like Robert E. Lee won dramatic victories, and Union armies suffered demoralizing setbacks. In 1863, as Lee's forces invaded the North, Lincoln's fortunes hung in the balance. The Union victory at Gettysburg in July marked a turning point, and Lincoln's brief speech there in November consecrated the battlefield and framed the war as a test of the nation's dedication to liberty and equality. Still, military success came slowly. Lincoln cycled through generals, searching for a leader with both strategic vision and relentless drive. He found this in Ulysses S. Grant, whose victories in the Western theater demonstrated both aggression and endurance. In 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant General-in-Chief of all Union armies, giving him full authority to coordinate a total war strategy. Grant's campaigns, alongside William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia, ground down the Confederacy's capacity to fight. The war entered its final, grueling phase, marked by sieges, scorched earth, and staggering casualties.
Lincoln weathered fierce political opposition during his bid for re-election in 1864, with many assuming he would lose. Yet the capture of Atlanta that autumn revitalized Northern morale, and he won decisively. His re-election signaled that the Union would fight to the finish. Lincoln's determination never wavered, even as the toll of war etched itself into his gaunt face and weary eyes. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Grant's forces closed in on Lee's army, and Union troops captured key Southern cities. On April 9, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the war. Lincoln entered Richmond, the fallen Confederate capital, to scenes of jubilation from newly freed black residents who hailed him as their liberator. He moved quickly to promote reconciliation, urging leniency toward the defeated South and envisioning a Reconstruction built on healing rather than vengeance. He had preserved the Union and struck a mortal blow against slavery, transforming the nation through blood and resolve. Lincoln emerged from the war as the embodiment of steadfast leadership, his once questioned judgment now vindicated by victory. He had guided the Union through its darkest trial, balancing force with compassion, pragmatism with principle. Under his command, the Republic had survived the storm and redefined its meaning. The Civil War had tested every fiber of his being, yet he endured, driven by an unshakable belief that the American experiment must not perish. In the crucible of war, he became not merely a president, but the guardian of a nation's soul.
In the months following the Union's victory, Abraham Lincoln turned his focus from war to peace, from destruction to reconstruction. The nation lay scarred and weary, its land ravaged, its economy fractured, its people burdened by grief. Lincoln understood that military triumph alone could not heal the wounds the Civil War had inflicted. The Union had been preserved, but it was fragile, held together by the exhaustion of battle rather than the bonds of trust. Lincoln believed that if the peace was not shaped carefully, the Union would fracture again, not through secession, but through resentment, poverty, and vengeance. He saw his duty not only as the savior of the Union, but as the builder of a new one, stronger and more just than the one that had fallen apart. His vision for Reconstruction began even before the war ended. As Union forces reclaimed Southern territories, Lincoln issued proclamations offering amnesty to Confederates who swore loyalty to the United States and accepted the end of slavery. His 10% plan proposed that once 10% of a state's voters pledged allegiance, they could form a new government and rejoin the Union. Critics in Congress called this approach too lenient, arguing that it allowed rebel states to return without fundamental change. But Lincoln saw leniency not as weakness but as necessity. He feared that harsh punishment would breed lasting bitterness, while reconciliation could bind the nation together. To him, the Union was not merely a geographic entity, it was a shared idea that must be nurtured back to life. Lincoln's commitment to mercy coexisted with his unwavering insistence on freedom. He knew the Union could not endure unless the institution of slavery, the very cause of the conflict, was eradicated. Throughout 1864, while the war still raged, he pushed Congress to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would permanently abolish slavery throughout the United States. It faced fierce opposition, but Lincoln used all his political skill to secure its passage, lobbying lawmakers, appealing to public opinion, and promising patronage to wavering representatives. In January 1865, the amendment passed Congress and was sent to the states for ratification. For Lincoln, it was the culmination of a moral struggle, transforming the legal foundations of the country. He regarded it as the crowning achievement of his presidency, declaring privately that it was a king's cure for the nation's deepest wound. While Congress debated how to reconstruct the South, Lincoln tried to set a tone of compassion and unity. He spoke of the future in almost spiritual terms, framing the end of the war not as the Union's triumph over enemies, but as the nation's redemption from its own sins.
His second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865 as the conflict drew to its close, captured this philosophy. He acknowledged the shared guilt of North and South for the crime of slavery, and called for malice toward none, charity for all, urging Americans to bind up the nation's wounds together. Those words resonated across a war-weary land, offering a glimpse of hope that the bitter divisions could be overcome. Lincoln sought to transform victory into reconciliation, believing that the moral greatness of the Union would be measured not by how it punished its foes, but by how it welcomed them back. He also recognized the practical challenges that lay ahead. The Southern economy was in ruins, its infrastructure destroyed, its currency worthless, its labor system upended. Millions of formerly enslaved people faced an uncertain future, free in name but often destitute and vulnerable. Lincoln believed they must be given protection and opportunities to build independent lives, though he moved cautiously, wary of provoking further resistance from white Southerners. He supported limited black suffrage, especially for educated men and Union veterans, hinting at a gradual expansion of rights. He encouraged the establishment of schools and aid organizations to help the freedmen adjust to freedom. Lincoln understood that freedom without support could dissolve into chaos, and that the Union could not be whole unless its new citizens were given the means to thrive. Lincoln's Reconstruction policies reflected his deep sense of balance. He sought to hold the nation together without crushing the defeated, to extend liberty without provoking rebellion, to restore government without abandoning justice. Many radicals in his own party thought his plan too forgiving, while former Confederates thought it too demanding. Yet Lincoln remained convinced that reconciliation was the only path to lasting peace. He imagined the South rising again not as a conquered province, but as an equal partner in a renewed union, its loyalty regained not by force but by trust. He wanted the Union to be not merely restored, but transformed, cleansed of slavery, united by shared ideals rather than coerced obedience. Even as he mapped the future, Lincoln moved quietly to implement it. He oversaw the installation of loyal governments in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas, using them as models for other states. He pressed for economic reconstruction that would rebuild railroads, reopen commerce, and restore agriculture on free labor. He planned to bring the South states back swiftly, before resentment hardened and northern political factions could impose harsher terms. He believed time was crucial, that the longer the South remained excluded, the more alienated it would become, and the more likely that peace would unravel. Lincoln carried these plans like a blueprint etched into his mind, even as the war's final battles unfolded. He knew the task of healing would be longer and perhaps more difficult than the war itself. The conflict had decided what the Union would not be, divided, slaveholding, but not yet what it would become. Lincoln intended to guide the nation through that uncertain passage, to help it emerge not only united but transformed. He saw in the ashes of war the raw material for a new beginning, and he believed that the nation could be reborn on principles of liberty, justice, and mutual respect. In the closing weeks of his life, Lincoln spoke often of peace, of reconciliation, of the work that still lay ahead. He walked through the streets of Richmond after its fall, reflecting on how the capital of the Confederacy could become a city of the Union again. He imagined former enemies working side by side as countrymen. He saw beyond victory to the fragile dawn of a new nation, one that would endure not by fear, but by the consent and dignity of all its people. For Lincoln, this was the final purpose of all the suffering, not to break the South, but to heal America. In that vision, he stood not just as the savior of the Union, but as its architect, ready to build from ruins a republic worthy of the sacrifices that had saved it.
In the spring of 1865, only days after the Confederate surrender had signaled the end of the long and bloody Civil War, Abraham Lincoln walked beneath the dim glow of gas lamps toward Ford's Theater in Washington, unaware that his life was nearing its abrupt and tragic conclusion. The war had left him weary, aged beyond his years, yet within him glimmered a fragile hope that peace would bring healing to the torn nation. As he took his seat that night, the air was filled with laughter and music, a rare respite from the darkness of recent years. But behind the velvet curtains, John Wilkes Booth, a fervent Confederate sympathizer, plotted his act of vengeance. With a single gunshot to the back of Lincoln's head, the fragile moment of joy shattered into chaos, and the man who had carried the Union through its greatest trial collapsed, never to rise again. News of his death spread like wildfire through the dawn-lit streets of Washington, reaching across the country by telegraph within hours. Shock and disbelief gripped the North and the newly subdued South alike. The bells of churches tolled in mournful rhythm, draped in black crepe, and shop windows were darkened as if the entire nation had fallen under a sudden eclipse. Crowds gathered in silence outside the White House, their faces streaked with tears, unable to comprehend that the towering figure who had guided them through war could be struck down at the very threshold of peace. His assassination transformed Lincoln instantly from a living leader into a martyr for the cause of liberty and unity, a man whose blood seemed to consecrate the fragile rebirth of the Union. The funeral procession that carried his body became a national pilgrimage. Placed within a black-draped railcar, his coffin embarked on a slow journey from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, retracing in reverse the path he had once taken as a humble lawyer rising toward the presidency. At every stop, vast crowds gathered, lining the tracks for miles, standing in solemn silence as the train passed. Farmers left their plows, factory workers their machines, and school children their lessons to bow their heads. In New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and countless smaller towns, mourners waited for hours just to glimpse the coffin and leave behind flowers, flags, or whispered prayers. The grief was not confined to the North. Even in parts of the defeated South, former enemies spoke with reluctant reverence, acknowledging that the man who had fought them had also sought to reconcile them. In death, Lincoln had united more hearts than he ever could in life. Yet his passing left an immense void, and with it an unspoken question: what would become of the fragile peace he had forged? Lincoln had envisioned a reconstruction marked by mercy and understanding, where the wounds of war might be bound up without reopening old hatreds. Without his steady hand, that vision faltered. Radical voices clamored for vengeance, while others resisted even the smallest steps toward equality. The work of rebuilding the South and integrating millions of freed men and women into the civic life of the nation became a task burdened by conflict and compromise. Still, the foundation Lincoln had laid endured. The 13th Amendment, passed under his watch, had forever ended slavery in the United States, and his words continued to echo in congressional chambers and schoolhouses alike, urging the country to strive for a just and lasting peace. As the years passed, Lincoln's image grew into something greater than the man himself. Painters and sculptors enshrined his likeness in marble and bronze. Writers described him as the savior of the Union, the great emancipator, the embodiment of democratic virtue. Children memorized his speeches, especially the Gettysburg Address, which distilled the meaning of the American experiment into a few spare sentences about government of the people, by the people, for the people. For countless immigrants arriving on distant shores, Lincoln became the proof that humble birth was no barrier to greatness, that America was a land where determination and principle could lift a person from a log cabin to the highest office in the land.
To Black Americans, his legacy was more complicated, both the deliverer of freedom and the symbol of promises yet unfulfilled. But even they often carried his portrait in marches and protests, invoking his name as a reminder that the nation owed them the equality he had proclaimed. Over time, his presence seemed to seep into the very stones of the country he had preserved. The Lincoln Memorial rose like a temple on the banks of the Potomac, its white columns sheltering a seated figure carved from Georgia marble, his gaze solemn and unyielding. There, generations would gather to mourn, to hope, and to demand justice, seeing in his silent form the embodiment of their better angels. His words, etched on the walls, would remind them of the enduring struggle to make the Union he saved into the nation he dreamed it could become. Lincoln's life had ended in sudden violence, but his influence did not. He had left behind not only a preserved nation, but a moral example, that power should serve the people, not rule them, that compassion could be as strong as steel, that democracy could endure even when tested by its darkest storm. His journey from the rough-hewn floor of a Kentucky cabin to the highest office in the land became a parable of the American spirit, and his death sealed his story in the minds of millions as one of sacrifice, courage, and unwavering faith in human dignity. Through triumph and tragedy, Abraham Lincoln became more than a man. He became the enduring symbol of freedom, justice, and humanity, and the cornerstone on which a new America continued to rise.